Hi, everyone. Hope that your evening is going well. I thought rather than doing our typical Bible study, I might detour just a little bit to talk about something that I think is particularly important, especially with everything that's going on. I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about hope. Um, Sometimes the way that we use language tends to have a lot of flexibility in it, especially think of like the word love. I might use the word love to describe, I love playing basketball. I love my wife. I love my children. I love pizza. Love has this sort of flexibility to it that can mean a lot of different things, and has similar connotations, but very different meanings depending on how it's used. So um, I'm probably not meaning the exact same thing to say I love pizza and I love my wife. But we get a sense that there's an intense liking for pizza, but there's something much deeper when I use the word love when talking about my wife. So language has this way of not just having necessarily one meaning or connotation. It's really contextual and has some different frameworks that might be at play depending on how and when it's used. Well, I certainly think that is true also for the word hope. So we have sometimes used the word hope as maybe something that is intended to say wishful thinking. We're not sure if it's going to happen, and so we're just holding on for the slightest possibility that something might happen. We hope for this intended outcome. So I hope I win the lottery, or I hope tomorrow it's a nice day, or I hope, and so it has this sort of connotation as wishful thinking, that we aren't exactly sure what the outcome is, but we're hoping, we are wishing that it would come to this sort of outcome for us. That kind of language for hope is really rooted in a sort of circumstantial understanding of hope, that it's sort of based on the momentary situation and seeing what might come out of that. So it's very situational or circumstantial kind of hope. There's also a different kind of connotation that I think is more the biblical understanding of hope. Um, that is less situational. In other words, it's not simply impacted whether things are going well for me or not, but there's something larger, bigger, grander that is at work in that language of hope. For instance, reading from Romans 5, and if you remember, this was part of what we read for worship this last Sunday. Romans 5, starting in verse 1, says, "Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person someone might actually dare to die. But God proves God's love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more surely then, now that we have been justified by his blood, will we be saved through him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, will we be saved by his life. But more than that, we even boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation." So the idea of hope has a much broader framework when we talk about the kind of Christian hope that is rooted in something much larger than just a circumstantial situation. Whether that is difficulty and struggle, as Romans talks about, the kinds of things that require endurance and perseverance. Hope is rooted in not just simply the circumstances. Hope is rooted in a person. So when we talk about hope, I want us to think about a narrative framework that is at play for Paul, and as he is talking to the Roman community who has endured suffering, has endured persecution, has endured difficult days. He is writing a word of encouragement to them, not to say that, hey, God's going to change your circumstances, but rather there is a hope that draws us through those moments of difficulty. And in the moment of difficulty, we are sort of transformed as we continue to persevere and endure. Our character is built, our lives are transformed and changed and shaped more and more into the likeness of Christ. And so thinking of, for instance, that old story about what makes a diamond is the coal that is being pressured so much so that it creates that diamond. Diamonds are really a result of pressure, all sorts of pressure that's being impacted on this particular lump of stone. And in the same kind of way, the pressures that are mounting for the Roman community provide the context for hope to emerge. But again, not a hope that is rooted in the circumstance, because circumstances change. They can go great one minute and the next minute it is in the ditch. But rather it's rooted in something that's beyond just the circumstances that the Roman church finds themselves in. And in the same way, I think there's something that is deeper when we talk about Christian hope for us as we are undergoing rapid changes in what's happening around the world. When we think about the circumstances of this pandemic, there's all sorts of things that are in flux, and the circumstances and situations change sometimes minute by minute. And so in those kinds of situations where anxiety and fear and maybe even difficulty are present, hope exceeds that. Hope is not bound by those sort of circumstances. And so as we're thinking about hope, I want to reframe it just a little bit to say, what is the narrative framework of hope? Well, if you read the rest of Romans, there's a part where it talks about Abraham, who, though being barren in his body and recognizing that he is unable to have children, continues to follow God's call to go from his land and to follow God faithfully into the unknown on the basis of a promise that was given to him. You will be the father of many nations. And that promise is rooted in the sort of relationship that is already beginning to develop between Abraham and God. The promise is connected to the character of God. And because God is a God that has invited Abraham into something that is much larger than Abraham's capacity to fulfill, and because God is the one who will journey with Abraham, and God continues to demonstrate that, the promise that is given begins to elicit and erupt into a pervasive hope that allows Abraham to take each step along the journey, despite not always knowing where the journey will take him or how God's promises will be fulfilled. The promise that is initially given is then further validated and rooted in the very character and nature of God as God continues to reveal God's own person to Abraham. In other words, hope is personal. So to maybe provide a different context, when somebody tells me they're going to do something, say a close friend, and that close friend is somebody that I have developed a long history with, where I have been able to find that when they say they're going to do something, their word is trustworthy. The promise that they give, I know will be followed through, though I don't always know the way or the timing or exactly how it's going to happen. And in a similar kind of way, because there has been a relationship that has been developed, the promise is rooted in the relationship between me and that friend. and I recognize I can trust the promise because I can trust them. Hope is in that same kind of vein because the relationship with God has been developed, because we have seen the way that God continues to be present and continue to walk alongside us. Hope begins to grow and bloom as that relationship is more firmly rooted, and we begin to recognize the trustworthy character and nature of God over time. The same story is happening all through the life of Israel. Now, it always seems to happen in fits and starts. Israel goes through moments where, can we trust God? We don't know. This is a difficult moment. Where is God? Why has God sent us into exile? Why has God abandoned us? Why is God silent? And in the difficult moments, that seems to be the question that everybody asks. Where is God? Why is God not acting in the ways that we would anticipate? Why is God silent? But as Israel continues to move along on this trajectory of this questioning of asserting trust in God and then having that trust challenged and tested, the promise remains. And in terms of Christian hope and faith, we have this additional piece that we find to be perhaps the most foundational, that the relationship between God and humanity takes an even greater step in that while we were still distant, while we were still enemies, while we were still sinners, God comes and becomes part of us, part of our world, and enters into the fray with us in the person of Jesus, puts on our flesh. The one who spoke the word and creation was brought into existence is also the God that puts on flesh and tabernacles among us. And so we begin to see the character and nature of God exhibited in the person of Jesus, that while we were still distant, while we were still at odds with God, God begins to move toward us in order to draw us into the very life of God. And thus the gap that was between us and God is now being bridged in the person of Jesus, so that the divinity of God and the humanity of us is brought together in one person, in one place. And no longer brought asunder, but brought together in the person of Jesus. This is the relational piece between God and humanity that is the very foundation for hope. It's the relational piece that is consistent with the character and nature of God from the very beginning and all the way to the very end. So as I begin to think about what's going on around us and just everything feeling so scattered and chaotic, what roots us in hope? If it's the circumstantial nature of everything that's going around us, then hope will be fleeting. Hope will be temporary. Hope will be tested and found wanting. If it's that kind of thing, like hope is rooted on whether things are going well for me or not, we will find that hope dissipates. We find ourselves cynical or broken and anxious. But if hope has a deeper ground in which to grow and take root, and I'm thinking here the very character and nature of God, whom all the promises of God are brought into fulfillment in the person of Jesus, if that is where hope is rooted, and knowing that God is not a God of distance, not a God who leaves us alone in the wilderness, in the difficult moments, but actually joins with us, binds with us in the difficult moments, then hope takes on a very different character. It's the kind of character that begins to draw us through the difficult moments, recognizing not that the difficult moments will go away, but even in the difficult moments, God might be doing something in and through us to draw us closer to Him, to draw us closer to one another, and in many ways, even draw us closer to the creation of which we are a part. To think of this story of hope then as this sort of arc, beginning in the initial relationship between God and humanity in the garden, and how that gets sort of broken, and then God is always constantly working to bring that back together, and begins to do that in the person of Jesus. And we wait with longing for the fulfillment of our hope, that God and humanity would no longer be fully divided, but brought together, and all things would be redeemed. we get to the end of the story in the book of Revelation. Now, in Revelation, we tend, especially in the North American Western context, there has been a particular reading that reads Revelation as looking at the world and saying, man, this is so far gone, and God's just going to wipe God's hands of it, and everything's just going to collapse. Now, there's all sorts of things that do collapse in the book of Revelation, but we really need to understand the book of Revelation is a book of hope. For a people that have been persecuted intensely during the Roman Empire, the Christians find themselves in difficult moments, like a fiery furnace, wondering if God will actually come through, if God will deliver, if God will save, if God is present, if God is silent. Where is God? These are the kinds of questions that this community is wrestling with, these 7 churches whom John writes and encourages to continue on in faith. But that's the book of Revelation is this: God has won the victory. And in the end, all will be made well, all will be made whole. And we can trust in that, because God who has continued to pursue us, God who has drawn near to us, will be the same God who will fulfill the promises that were given at the very beginning, that all people will be blessed and all the world will be restored and all will be made whole. So we don't enter into these moments of desperation. We don't enter into the moments of the world's sort of chaos out of fear, but rather this sort of hope that is rooted in the promises of God, because we know the character and nature of God is one who loves and draws near to us and enters into the suffering alongside us, and then invites us to be the very hands and feet of Christ, present in the world in the midst of the suffering, not set apart, brought apart from the suffering, but through the suffering that we might make known the very glory of God in our world. In other words, that we wouldn't hide our light under a bushel, but that we would shine the light of Jesus, shine the light of God in the dark places of the world. And I think as we begin to do that, as we begin to serve our neighbors in such a way that we are extending the very love of God into the world, we are bearers of hope in the places of despair, we find that we ourselves are being renewed in hope, because we are also being drawn to the very person of God again through our neighbor. This is the cycle of hope. This is the narrative of hope. It is rooted in the person of Jesus. It is the very character and nature of God, whom we can trust all the promises of God, because God is trustworthy. God has demonstrated time and time and time again that God is not only with us, but God is for us. And if God is with us and for us, then who can be against us? Now, I do want to say one final piece in that. When we talk about hope, hope is then not a club that we begin to beat people over the heads with to try to get them in fearful kinds of ways to respond to God. That's not our job. Our job is to, in those moments where people are hurting, fearful, not sure what to do, that we love them, that we serve them with humility and with all grace, in the same ways that God has come to us with love and grace. In the person of Jesus, we are reminded in the book of Philippians chapter 2 that though Jesus was God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but instead emptied himself, becoming a servant, and even being obedient to the point of death. That this is the same call for the church, who are bearers of hope. Not that we would win, that's not the point, but that we would be faithful in bearing the hope of Christ, which we ourselves have received, and enduring all suffering with patience, so that character is formed, and as character is formed, hope burgeons anew. God bless you. Hope you have a great rest of the evening.